It is obvious at this stage of the 2023 Formula One season that Red Bull has a really great racing car. Heck, even the Aston Martin team has dared to borrow a few ideas from the Red Bull setup. And the performance of the RB19 was evident in Saudi Arabia, where it was always a second or two quicker than the rest. But racing is more than a good car, and the RB19 has its flaws too. No doubt, these will be addressed if the Red Bull team wants to be unstoppable. We will discuss these flaws shortly, so stick around. The curse of the cost cap. Here's a brief history of the cost cap issue. Back in 2016, Liberty Media took over the administrative management of the FIA from Bernie Ecclestone. It was more or less regarded as a hostile takeover. Liberty Media proceeded to go over the logs and came to the conclusion that some teams had an unfair advantage overall. Bernie's management had sort of skewed the competition in the favor of the bigger racing teams. It was a commercial problem that Liberty Media hoped to regularize in order to level the playing field. Or is it a racing field? So they put Ross Brawn in charge of running the series. And the first order of business was to change the rules. To put things in context, between 2016 and 2018, only 3 teams out of the entire field laid claim to 121 pole positions in that period. So where were the other teams? Brawn suggested that those teams had an unfair advantage in terms of their spending power. And the fact that top finishes had become predictable was bad for the sport in the mid to long term. Ross Brawn would adopt a two-pronged approach. A spending cap would be introduced, and the time spent in the wind tunnel would also be limited. Even so, there was the issue of the rules being adjusted on the fly, and the bigger teams complained that they were being treated unfairly for daring to lead the pack. And this was the case whenever a team was ahead on the leaderboard. The new rules meant that if you were in front, your allowances would be adjusted accordingly. Essentially, your potential for development would be downgraded by a few points to level the playing field. And if your team was that good, then it would matter little as the season progressed. But all in all, it made for a more competitive season. Presently, Red Bull are leading, and consequently, all those new rules apply, including the ones that are yet to be implemented on the fly. For instance, Verstappen started the Bahrain race from the 15th position, and it's potentially random rules like this that Christian Horner, the Red Bull principal, has complained about. He has acknowledged that such impulsive rule changes could hurt their chances during this present season. Already the Red Bull team are facing penalties from last year on top of having to adhere to the new rules. The result is that their budget has been cut a lot more than was anticipated, and the resultant disadvantages might start to show soon enough in the season. On the flip side, Red Bull is already off to a flying start. Perhaps the team could mitigate these potential handicaps by outracing the competition early on. So as the season progresses and the cracks start to show, Red Bull will be so far ahead that it won't matter. Race car blues. The RB19 is looking like the car to beat, but underneath its hood lies a nagging problem. Both Red Bull drivers have complained about it, so it's not a trifling matter to be overlooked. This problem is evident in the fact that the Red Bull cars are barely finishing races, and it seems there's something slightly wrong with the transmission. Perez experienced it firsthand during the first race of the season in Bahrain. He and the pit crew had to tone down performance in order to make it to the end of that race. And if any other team car was charging the Red Bull setup, then it would have been a different story. They would have easily overtaken Perez or Verstappen, irrespective of each Red Bull driver trying to outdo one another for first place. As a consequence, the team could have lost the race if the rivalry was taken too far. Add to that the slow finishes, and you begin to see how the problem would have unfolded. It's essentially a reliability issue that could get worse during the season if not addressed on time. If you think Perez had a thing to say about reliability, his teammate, Verstappen, was even more vocal. Now, we all know that he has very high standards and doesn't like being handicapped if he can help it. This attitude was expressed at the Jeddah meet in Saudi Arabia. He had a few suggestions on his mind about what needed to be improved in the car. For starters, the drive shaft failed during qualifying, and Verstappen was especially annoyed at the crew for being fixated on finding a sweet spot in terms of design and engineering that they ignored other aspects of the Bahrain race between testing and actual racing. Last season, Verstappen also had reason to complain about a DRS activation problem, and it goes to show that being the perfectionist he is, he hates having to deal with weaknesses. The Red Bull team have so far stamped their authority on the rest of the pack, and this became evident in Jeddah, which is only the second race of the season. Maybe Verstappen is overreacting and only needs to worry about Perez, his teammate, getting ahead. Perez had something to say about their seeming rivalry. As such, he questioned the rationality of racing one another and potentially risking a non-finish. In other words, if both cars got ruined due to reliability concerns, then it would all have been for nothing. Verstappen's Han Solo move. And then there's Verstappen's alleged selfishness to deal with. Depending on which side you're on, you could either regard Verstappen as egotistical or otherwise ambitious. But we have one more analysis of Verstappen's behavior that quite rightly unifies the rest. Verstappen is simply being individualistic. In one instance, he ignored his race engineer's instruction to hit a delta time during the Jeddah meet, probably because he knew better, or perhaps again he was simply being individualistic. The transcript of their correspondence is on record, so Verstappen cannot deny this after the fact. Verstappen, however, made this decision so he could catch up with Perez, his teammate, after his drive shaft got bad. On the other hand, his team's argument was they were only trying to adjust his pace downwards in consideration of his drive shaft, which was in addition to starting at 15th. So the crew meant well for him, and Verstappen himself was aware of these constraints. And yet he chose his own path. Verstappen went as far as saying he didn't volunteer just so he could end up playing second fiddle. But his grouse had a lot more to it. From the car to the other little details, which all added up to that point, Verstappen was only showing his competitive side. He was probably being petty too. He had the fastest lap time in Jeddah and telegraphed this fact to his pit crew, but they replied saying they were not concerned with that stat at the moment. Fortunately, this show of individualism didn't result in something more problematic. Perez, on the other hand, was more level-headed, and it's probably the reason he won the race. But in truth, Perez hardly ever beats Verstappen, and the Jeddah race was one of those rare moments where everything went south for Verstappen. That is, if finishing second can qualify as a failure. Verstappen would, however, argue that his car needed some work. Either way, you could even say that pit crews visualize way more data than the driver will ever see as he races, so they are in a better position to give instruction. Apparently, too, the rejigging of the rules has thrown everyone off guard. Ferrari are struggling with the SF23 car. The Mercedes team may as well be screwed because of the overhaul of their car. The only winners, or at least second best winners from all of this, is the Aston Martin team. Plus, they have a very capable driver presently in the person of Fernando Alonso. The Aston Martin team this year can be regarded as the closest we'd ever get to a strong Red Bull challenger. And with the FIA breathing down the neck of the Red Bull team for daring to win, the stakes become higher. Christian Horner could borrow a leaf from Otto Wolff, the Mercedes principal, by not fully disclosing the team data. Maybe this move might buy them some leverage. Otto has since come out to deny that he ever withheld information, but is it against the rules to hold your cards close to your chest? Let's not give those rule policing guys at the FIA any ideas.